America is once again grieving the victims of another mass shooting.
It's not fair and it's not right. And now I'll forever have to have a bullet in my back. For no reason.
Why did I get cancer? Why did I get heart disease when I've been eating good food and meditating and exercising? Why do these things happen? And it's because you've joined this human race. It's what happens when you're a human being. As I've said before you are reincarnated, you should have read the small print in the contract which you signed to get born. It meant, number one, you can die at any time, for any reason, either being hit by a truck, or being killed in a tsunami, or having cancer, or all sorts of other things. You can die at any time. This is par for the course. This is part of being a human being. So what it means is that this is our truth, this is our nature, this is what we've got ourselves into. So we know this is happening, and once we're truthful about this, we know it can happen. It's amazing just what that particular truth, it's not because of somebody else, it's not because of this or that. We know that this is part of having this human journey. Once we understand that and accept it, we can actually just make strategies to know it can happen and that it's not, we're not exempt from these things. Then we can do our very, very best to lessen our chances of having these tragedies. Once we know it's possible, this is par for the course, then we want to make sure that we reduce the opportunities we have for these terrible traumas and problems. And we can do a lot. And doing something to make sure that we lessen our chances for pain and suffering and difficulty is what the law of karma is all about. So we're trying our very best. We realize that we do have choices. And what we want to do is to make such choices that we limit the possibility of trauma and torture and pain and tragedy. So, we do exercise, we do try and eat well, we do try and do the very, very best, but even so, we know that that's not enough. Sometimes it just doesn't work. That's part of the course. All we're doing is increasing our chances. But it also means, and this is probably one of the most important parts of Buddhism, is that when that trauma and problems happen, we don't think, oh, it was my mistake, it's somebody up there's not looking after me. We don't get into the guilt and anger, because the guilt and anger which comes when a person experiences pain, torture, suffering or whatever, that type of guilt and anger again stops the healing happening. It just makes that pain stay for longer and longer and longer. I remember a family who, this is many, many years ago, so I don't mind talking about this family. She would be a regular at one of my meditation groups, and after one evening, it was actually her friend said, you better talk to this lady because she's in a big trouble. When I talked to her after the meeting, her trouble was that she'd found out her husband had been sexually abusing her kids. The signs were seen at the primary school where her two kids were attending. It was reported to the police. It was investigated. It was true. The father confessed. So there was a real big problem, huge problem for her and her kids. Fortunately, she was a Caucasian, she was a Buddhist, she had enough understanding about the Dhamma, about the truth, about the nature of life and the mind, to first of all let go of what most mothers would feel at that time, guilt and self-blame. Because that's your kids. I should have seen the signs. Why couldn't I protect these people? Why did I choose a man like that? You can understand just how blame is a very easy response to have. I'm talking about self-blame here. But because of all of the teaching she had heard over the years, she realized that this can happen to anybody. She understands that the nature of a mother's love to her kids and also love to her partner was such that we just cannot see the things which we don't want to see. It's a nature of a mind to be often in denial. So what is very painful and hard and difficult, what we don't want to see because it's going to break up our whole life, it's natural that we can't see that. Sometimes we just can't do anything about it. It's just part of the psychology of our mind. Straight away, she'd understood that all of sort of the blaming of herself, she realized she wasn't to blame, she was a good mother, she was a good partner, she was doing her very best, but she just could not see it. And there was a reason she could not see it. Because it was just too painful for the senses to actually allow in to her mind. So straight away the self-blame had been let go of. And I don't know how many times that I've said here that guilt has got no place in Buddhism. Blaming oneself is just allowing the problem to fester, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. She'd heard that many times, she understood the reason for that, so she wasn't blaming herself. And of course the next thing was blaming the partner. And of course that's a very easy thing to do when that person is responsible for so much pain and suffering, to your own kids and to a relationship, a marriage you put so much of your time and effort of yourself into, destroyed by this. And it's disgusting. But again, because of her understanding of karma, understanding of the nature of the mind, the nature of happiness, wisdom, kindness, compassion, she was able to let go very quickly of any hatred or ill will towards her partner. We all know that hatred and ill will, it hurts us much more than it hurts the object of our anger. The old statement that getting angry at somebody else is like picking up a hot coal and trying to throw it at them. Most times you miss, but every time you pick up a hot coal you burn yourself. Every time you get angry at another person, you always hurt. That's 100% true. Sometimes the other person hurts, but most times they don't. But you always hurt. So getting angry at another person, even though it's a culturally accepted response in a place like Australia, people who understand the nature of the mind and the nature of the world realize that anger is just totally dysfunctional. It doesn't help at all. It doesn't serve its purpose of solving problems. So she understood that very well because she'd been meditating, she'd been exposed to these Buddhist teachings. So instead of getting angry and blaming someone else, she took responsibility for it. Not in a way of anger or guilt. That's not taking responsibility. Taking responsibility means this is a situation we're faced with. Without any blame or anger, how can we move forward? We can't change the past. Anger, guilt is all about messing around with the past. It's obvious to people, but sometimes, as I said to someone earlier, we need to come and listen to these talks every Friday night for many years until we get properly brainwashed, so we don't need to get in anger or guilt ever again. It's so free to realize that these things happen and you don't have to follow that path. And so instead of guilt or sort of anger, she let go of that pain. What she did was, obviously, there's no way she could live with a man like that again. He had to go to jail anyway. The relationship was gone, but she had no anger towards him, realizing the anger was not going to hurt him, and it was only going to hurt her and her children. She actually let that go very quickly. And it was an interesting experience for me, because as her teacher, She told me later on, she actually wrote to me, she got herself into another problem, but it was an easier problem to solve, and that was because she was the mother of the kids, that she had to go to counselling. It was obligatory for her, because she'd been in this traumatic situation, and they realised that she had to be counselled out of it. Unfortunately, the counsellor had no understanding about Buddhist attitudes, and so when she came along and said, "No, I don't hate that guy, I don't want him to go to hell, I don't want to sort of murder him or whatever," the counsellor thought that she was in denial. Because we all know that you want to sort of string that person up by his, well, I shouldn't say what, but you know what I mean. And this is obvious that everybody would like to torture him back for what he did. Everyone would like to get angry, but they didn't know that Buddhists don't do that. And so when she said that, look, I've let it go, that obviously that I can't love that guy anymore. Obviously I think he's just a terrible guy and needs a lot of help, but I'm not going to get angry, I'm not going to have ill will against him anymore. And it needed me to write a long letter to the counsellor explaining basic Buddhist principles before she was let out of the counselling sort of roundabout. Because she was in that catch-22 situation. Only when she admitted there was a problem that she could get released. Because there wasn't a problem, she could not get released. And so she was in that situation, but fortunately the counsellor understood, and it was a wonderful experience to say this was a real person in a real trauma who'd actually dealt with it in a beautiful way, and there was follow-up. Because that was many years ago, and even last year I got a Christmas card from the family. They moved to another place. They're doing fine.